Viewer discretion is advised.
William George Bonin was an American serial killer and sex offender who raped, tortured, and murdered young men and boys between November 1968 and June 1980 in Southern California. He was convicted of 14 murders, but he confessed to 21 and is suspected of even more. Bonin's first known murder victim was killed in May 1979. He generally operated by luring his victims into his van under the pretense of having consensual sex. He became known as the Freeway Killer. Because most of his victims' bodies were discovered beside freeways. On many occasions, he was helped by one of his 4 known accomplices. One of them, Vernon Butts, was listed in court as an accomplice for 12 murders. He died via suicide before his trial in 1982. William George Bonin was born in Willimantic, Connecticut, on January 8, 1947, the second of 3 sons to Robert Leonard Bonin Sr. and Alice Dorothy Coate. Both parents were alcoholics, and his father an ill-tempered World War II veteran who physically abused his wife and children. His mother suffered from severe mood swings and frequented a bingo parlor while her sons remained unattended. She was regarded as having a domineering and emasculating presence in Bonin's early life. In January 1950, Bonin's father, a compulsive gambler, gambled away their home in Andover, Connecticut, forcing the family to reside with Bonin's maternal grandmother in Willimantic. In spite of this dysfunctional environment, Bonin and his brothers were actively raised Catholic and baptized according to church doctrine. They attended St. Mary's Catholic School, where staff repeatedly made complaints of Bonin's aggression toward other students, truancy, and other misbehavior. After riding his bike into a group of young girls, he was briefly placed in juvenile hall. After returning home, he was reportedly more uncooperative toward his parents than before. In September 1953, Bonin and his older brother, Robert Jr., were placed at the Franco-American School, a Catholic convent, in Lowell, Massachusetts. The convent enforced harsh discipline by staff, with extreme assault being commonplace. Bonin recalled nuns forcing him to punch a fence when he misbehaved. Records indicate he was observed to function well in this structured environment. According to witnesses, Bonin was bullied and was once sexually assaulted by an older boy in 1955. According to Bonin, the older boy approached Bonin for sex, and Bonin asked the boy to tie his hands behind his back, which he said would allow him to feel secure and less frightened. Bonin was then bound and sexually assaulted. During this time at the convent, neither parent visited Bonin or his brother, and Bonin became worried his parents had died. Bonin was to remain at the convent until May 1955, when he returned to live with his parents in a home owned by Bonin's maternal grandfather in Mansfield. In Mansfield, Bonin attended Annie Vinton Elementary School with his younger brother Paul, where he was ridiculed as Bugsy Bonin. He became a juvenile delinquent who quarreled with students. Bonin recalled feeling shame at his sexual attraction to younger children and male teachers. Neighbors later failed to recollect his parents spending time with their children, and one worried neighbor, observing they were unkempt and hungry, provided meals and clean clothes to Bonin and Paul out of sympathy. Until Bonin's first incarceration, the children were left with their maternal grandfather by Bonin's mother, a known child molester who had sexually abused her. She later speculated her father molested his grandsons. Bonin and Paul were also left with Robert Jr., who, having received the brunt of their father's abuse, often beat and belittled his siblings. Largely devoid of consequences and parental supervision, Bonin stole hubcaps, license plates, and metal tags off vehicles around town. In 1957, he was placed in a juvenile detention center for these and other petty crimes. While incarcerated, Bonin was molested by an adult counselor, and following his release, he began sexually fondling his younger brother Paul. After 6 months, however, Paul informed their mother of Bonin's fondling, and Bonin was forced to sleep in a separate bedroom. Bonin later confessed to molesting young boys and exposing himself to a 10-year-old girl. In 1959, Bonin attended middle school adjacent to Coventry High School. Despite showing a strong aptitude for math and science, he had otherwise mediocre grades. In late 1960, the family faced the prospect of foreclosure, and Bonin's mother kicked their father out of the home, winning custody of the siblings. The parents reconciled, however, after their father was offered lucrative employment as a machinist in Downey, California. In early 1962, they purchased a tract home in nearby Torrance. Bonin attended North High School in Torrance, where he was regarded as a social outcast. However, Paul later recalled him as an outwardly well-behaved teenager. Bonin was uncomfortable around his peers, and is not known to have formed any friendships throughout his adolescence. He spent his time at a local bowling alley. By his teenage years, Bonin held an intense interest in pedophilia, but kept his emerging feelings a secret. His pederasty became the basis of conflict with his mother, leading to frequent arguments. He rarely attempted to interact with girls, but once reluctantly dated a girl named Linda to please his mother. After dropping out of high school in 1966, Bonin molested several neighborhood children. His mother reportedly refused to acknowledge these acts or his escalating antisocial behavior, but frequently worried he would be arrested. She prayed for him and warned him often, much to his frustration. Eventually, she evicted him from their house for undisclosed reasons. Lacking motivation and often borrowing money from his parents, Bonin joined the United States Air Force with his mother's encouragement in December 1966. He became engaged to Linda, a decision largely determined by Bonin's mother, who felt it would quell his attraction to pubescent boys. During the engagement, he repeatedly told Linda that he had recurring nightmares about the sexual assault and murder of a young woman. During his military service, Bonin completed a general equivalency diploma and served as a cook for 4 months in Alaska. He was arrested for theft on October 25, 1967, but the charges were dropped due to his imminent deployment to Vietnam. Stationed in Pu Loi Base Camp, he served 5 months of active duty in the 205th Assault Support Helicopter Unit as an aerial gunner, logging over 700 hours of combat and patrol time. Bonin later claimed that his wartime experiences instilled misanthropic beliefs. Despite this, he is known to have risked his own life on one occasion while under enemy fire to save a wounded fellow airman. For this act, Bonin received a medal in recognition of his gallantry, among other medals. Bonin said he engaged in allegedly consensual relations with 4 young girls and had a number of homosexual encounters in Vietnam and once in Hong Kong. He also confessed to sexually assaulting 2 soldiers under his command at gunpoint around the time of the Tet Offensive. Bonin served nearly 3 years before receiving an honorable discharge on October 25, 1968, at age 21. Upon returning home, he discovered that Linda, who had given birth to their son, had left him to marry another man. The end of their relationship reportedly left him extremely frustrated. Working as a gas station attendant, Bonin returned to Downey to live with his parents, whom he resented for frequently requesting his help. Several family members noted differences in his behavior after his military service, although Bonin refused to explain these changes. On November 17, 1968, Bonin picked up 14-year-old Billy Jones in Arcadia, California, while driving his mother's car. Bonin offered to take him home, but Jones attempted to flee the vehicle in response to Bonin's repeated questions regarding homosexuality. Driving him to a nearby shopping center, Bonin handcuffed and raped him, knocking him unconscious in the process. He then dropped Jones off at a park. Returning home, Jones' mother promptly reported Bonin to police. On November 26th, Bonin picked up 17-year-old hitchhiker John Treadwell of Torrance. Bonin began asking him about fags and homosexuality before accelerating the vehicle and producing a handgun. Bonin parked in a secluded area. He then raped Treadwell and bludgeoned him with a tire iron. Bonin threatened that he had friends who would aid in avenging him if Treadwell told the man of what had happened. On December 4th, it was reported to the Torrance Police Department by 17-year-old Alan Pruitt that a man with medium-length dark hair and olive complexion had offered him a ride before deviating from the highway and handcuffing the boy, who was extensively sexually assaulted in the vehicle. On January 1, 1969, Bonin offered a ride to 12-year-old Lawrence Bretman in Hermosa Beach. Ignoring the boy's pleas to let him go, Bonin began threatening Bretman. He parked and forced Bretman to perform oral sex on him, molesting and robbing him at gunpoint. He then threatened to kill Bretman if he ever reported the incident. On January 12th, Bonin reportedly picked up 18-year-old hitchhiker Jesus Monge, asking him about homosexuality before offering him $20 to perform oral sex. When Monge attempted to exit the vehicle, Bonin physically and sexually assaulted him. He was then handcuffed and raped. Bonin threatened Monge, stating, "I'll rip your nuts off if you don't cool it." By this point, extensive efforts were being made by local police to locate a potential serial rapist that fit Bonin's description. On the 28th, an El Segundo policewoman confronted Bonin, who had frightened 16-year-old runaway Timothy Wilson, who was present with Bonin in Bonin's mother's vehicle. Noting Bonin's frantic state and similar profile to the rapist, she searched and handcuffed him. Bonin repeatedly advised her to incarcerate him, before insisting he was not responsible for his actions. He was indicted on 5 counts of kidnapping, 4 counts of sodomy, 1 count of oral copulation, and 1 count of child molestation against the 5 individuals he had abducted and assaulted, or attempted to assault, since the previous November. In March, Bonin underwent 2 psychiatric examinations, after which he was determined as being a sexual psychopath, who had little control over his impulses and showed signs of depression and inappropriate emotional responses. Initially denying childhood abuse, Bonin confessed to being molested at age 8 and suspected he was molested on various occasions between 9 and 12 years old. In May, Bonin recounted to a probation officer his recent stressful separation and admitted his guilt in molesting male youths, although he also expressed desire to start a family and become a pilot upon his release. He said that his Vietnam service contributed to his criminal behavior, emphasizing his difficulties in seducing female partners since his return. He was evaluated to be seriously lacking insight and responsibility for crimes committed since his childhood. He pleaded guilty to molestation and forced oral copulation and was sentenced to the Atascadero State Hospital in June 1969 as a mentally disordered sex offender considered amenable to treatment. Bonin arrived at the Atascadero State Hospital on June 17, 1969. He was subjected to a battery of psychiatric examinations, which revealed that he possessed an IQ of 121 and displayed traits of manic depression, sexual sadism disorder, and antisocial personality disorder. A physical examination revealed extensive scars on Bonin's head and buttocks, which he claimed to have no memory of obtaining, but were likely sustained in the Franco-American orphanage. This lack of acknowledgement led experts to conclude Bonin repressed memories of the more extreme aspects of his childhood abuse. They also noted the psychological and emotional implications of Bonin's unhealthy relationship with his mother, upon whom he remained emotionally dependent in spite of her low opinion of him. She considered him worthless as a human being. Bonin regularly attended group therapy sessions while incarcerated. Psychiatrists noted his defensive, aggressive attitude toward other patients and his refusal to acknowledge his homosexuality. Bonin divulged his intentions to eliminate any future victims of his sexual assaults, if he deemed it necessary. He was classified as an extreme sociopath with a high probability of recidivistic behavior under periods of psychotic breakdown. He was regarded as extremely disturbed, and his poor social skills with others were also viewed as hindering his own treatment. Despite this, Bonin willingly participated in experimental programs and was generally considered a nonviolent, helpful, and conscientious patient by staff. He had recited what he perceived psychiatrists desired to hear from him, believing he could manipulate them into granting him an early release. One psychiatrist wrote of Bonin that he wanted to straighten himself out, but doesn't know how to go about it. In 1971, Bonin was sent to the California Medical Facility, having been declared unsuitable for further treatment due to repeated sexual engagement with inmates, two of whom were mentally challenged. This, as well as alienating and irritating fellow patients, resulted in Bonin being beaten on several occasions. Bonin was subject to further psychiatric examination, which dealt with hostility toward his father and older brother. It was noted that his sexual behaviors were compulsive in response to stress. He also sought to raise money for the family of another prisoner and reportedly applied willingly for at least one treatment program. Bonin was released from prison on June 11, 1974, after doctors concluded he was no longer a danger to the health and safety of others. In July, Bonin rented an apartment in Hollywood, California, with intentions of circulating within the local gay community, but was largely unsuccessful due to poor social skills, and soon relocated to his parents' new house on 10282 Angel Street in Downey. He briefly worked as a bartender in Fountain Valley, and switched to being a truck driver for a Montebello delivery firm named Dependable Drive-Away in December 1974. He was fired from the job in February 1975 for wrecking a trailer. In March, Bonin attended community college classes for 2 semesters. Around this time, he would pick up hitchhikers for the purposes of having sex, eventually establishing a serious relationship with a single mother. While cruising for young boys on the night of September 8, 1975, he encountered 14-year-old David Allen McVicker hitchhiking in Garden Grove. McVicker accepted Bonin's offer to drive him to his parents' home in Huntington Beach. Shortly after McVicker entered the car, Bonin asked him if he had engaged in homosexuality. McVicker replied that he had not. He asked to leave the vehicle, which prompted Bonin to accelerate it. When McVicker attempted to leave, Bonin produced a gun and drove him to a deserted field. Bonin ordered him to undress and then beat and raped him. Bonin strangled him with his t-shirt and a tire iron. McVicker pleaded for his life. Bonin immediately stopped and apologized before reverting to casual conversation. He then drove McVicker to his home, stating on the way, "You know what? You're an all right guy. I was going to kill you, but I want to come back for you and use you again." Soon, McVicker phoned his mother, who promptly informed Garden Grove police of the incident. On October 11, 1975, Bonin was arrested for 2 assaults months later. Upon arrest, he informed law enforcement that next time there won't be any more witnesses. He was charged with the rape and forcible oral copulation of a minor and the attempted abduction of a 15-year-old boy 2 days after Bonin's assault on McVicker. This second victim rejected Bonin's offer of $35 for sex before exiting Bonin's van and telling him to leave. In response, Bonin drove the van onto the sidewalk in an attempt to strike him. Bonin pleaded guilty to both charges, and on December 31, 1975, he was sentenced to serve between 1 and 15 years imprisonment at the California Men's Facility in San Luis Obispo. In 1977, Bonin was subject to further psychiatric examination. It was indicated his sexual involvement with young boys related to his mother's micromanagement of his life. In March 1978, Bonin's father suffered a major stroke, presumably induced by his alcohol addiction, causing him to be hospitalized at the Long Beach Veterans Administration Hospital, where his mother worked as a vocational nurse. In prison, Bonin completed mathematics courses and training as a machinist in order to secure employment. He also showed significant progress in individual therapy sessions. As a result, he was released from detention on October 11th, with 18 months supervised probation. On November 1, 1978, Bonin moved to an apartment in the Kingswood Village complex, located approximately 1 mile from his parents' house. He became acquainted with his 43-year-old neighbor, Everett Scott Fraser. Bonin became a regular attendee at Fraser's parties, where young men, drugs, and alcohol were rife. Fraser considered him a respectful and placid individual, and frequently introduced Bonin to his young male acquaintances. The two also talked about their homosexuality. The following month, Bonin established a relationship with a married mother who held a criminal record for child cruelty. In April 1979, Bonin's parole supervision concluded. Later, Bonin and his brother Paul relocated to Silverado and ran a bar called the Alpine Inn. It was continually under scrutiny for noise violations. An incident occurred involving Bonin reportedly locking a 16-year-old runaway in a room of the building, threatening at knife point to bury his body in the hills. Unable to obtain a permanent liquor license due to Bonin's criminal record, the business venture was short-lived. Later, Bonin purchased a Ford van while working at his older brother's plumbing business. Through his frequent attendance at Fraser's parties, Bonin became acquainted with 21-year-old Vernon Robert Butts and 18-year-old Gregory Matthews Miley. Born and raised in Norwalk, Butts was 9 years old when his father died, and reportedly hailed from a broken home. Described by acquaintances as shy and easily led by others, Butts attempted suicide on 3 occasions prior to meeting Bonin. At the time of his initial acquaintance with Bonin, Butts had developed a local reputation as an eccentric figure who had recently been fired from his employment as a magic store clerk due to his unkempt appearance and increasingly strange and unpredictable behavior. He was bisexual and frequently abused drugs and alcohol. Butts was a drifter who had been in and out of penal institutions and held an extensive criminal record for offenses such as burglary and arson. He was later speculated by prosecutors to have developed a fascination with sadistic homosexual activity while incarcerated. He claimed to have been both enamored with and terrified of Bonin, whom he claimed held a kind of hypnotic control over him. In contrast, Bonin held Butts in high regard for his social popularity, dominance, and intelligence. Although both lived externally heterosexual lifestyles, the two soon became lovers. Butts also held mystery parties, in which up to 16 people searched for various murder artifacts in the city of Downey, such as a hairpin or ice pick. As a result, Bonin and Butts frequently discussed the subject of death. Miley was an illiterate Texas native and high school dropout with an IQ of 56. Raised in Lakewood, Miley's mother reportedly had a series of dysfunctional marriages and severely neglected him. Miley viewed Bonin as something of a father figure, and he often spent time with Bonin in exchange for a sexual relationship. Bonin usually selected young male hitchhikers, schoolboys, or, occasionally, male prostitutes as his victims. The victims, aged 12 to 19, were predominantly Caucasian or Latino, slender, pale, and long-haired. He either enticed or forced them into his Ford Econoline van, where they were overpowered and had their limbs bound with a combination of handcuffs, wire, or cords. They were then sexually assaulted, extensively beaten, and tortured, before typically being killed by strangulation with their own t-shirts and a tire iron. In order to minimize the chances of a victim escaping from the van, Bonin removed the door handles on the passenger side and rear door. He stowed ligatures, knives, pliers, wire coat hangers, and other such instruments in his vehicle to restrain and torture of his victims. The victims were usually killed inside his van, before their bodies were discarded around and near various freeways. In an apparent effort to weaken investigators, Bonin often discarded his victims' bodies in counties far from their abduction. One attorney present for Bonin's eventual court case said the escalating levels of brutality he had exhibited toward his victims had been similar to that of a drug addict, requiring an ever greater increase of dosage to maintain their euphoria. Bonin also likened his urges to addiction, emphasizing to neurologists his feelings of extreme restlessness and sexual frustration in the hours prior to his murders, and that he had felt an intense sense of excitement as he drove in search of his victims. Reserving Sundays for his girlfriend, he typically cruised the freeways on Fridays and Saturdays. Bonin also later described his feeling pleasure at hearing his victims scream and sodomizing them. Dr. Albert Rosenstein, a forensic psychologist, predicted the killer was an intelligent sex offender in his late 20s or early 30s, had spent time in a psychiatric facility, and was abused as a child. He said that, while bisexual, the killer has never been comfortable with their homosexuality and is repulsed by his actions. In a minimum of 12 of the murders, Bonin was assisted by one or more of his 4 known accomplices. Bonin later confessed that he felt a sense of social belonging with his accomplices that he had never experienced with anyone else. Butts is suspected of accompanying or assisting Bonin on at least 9 of Bonin's murders. He would scrapbook newspaper clippings of his murders and boast to Butts and Fraser about them. Following media coverage of the murders, Bonin enthusiastically mentioned them to co-workers at Dependable Drive-Away. To those unaware of his crimes, Bonin seemed obsessed with the case. He made daily trips to Orange County to buy newspapers. He would also tell people, "This guy is giving good gays like us a bad name." The first murder for which Bonin was charged was that of 13-year-old Thomas Glenn Lundgren. Lundgren was last seen leaving his parents' house in Reseda on May 28, 1979. Shortly before his abduction, Lundgren had reportedly told friends a man had offered to meet him at a skate park to take photos of him for a skateboarding magazine. Lundgren's partially clothed body was found the same afternoon in Agoura. His clothes and severed genitals were discovered in a nearby field. An autopsy revealed that Lundgren had suffered emasculation and extensive bludgeoning. In addition, he had been slashed across the throat, stabbed, and strangled to death. An expert postulated that Bonin's brutality was likely an attempt to silence his homosexual attraction to Lundgren. Bonin was assisted by Butts. On August 4th, Bonin drove from Silverado Canyon to Westminster to spend time with Butts. He soon suggested that they rape and murder a teenage hitchhiker. Butts was amenable to this suggestion, and Bonin encountered 17-year-old boy Mark Shelton near Beach Boulevard. Bonin offered $400 for sexual services. According to Bonin, he masturbated Shelton before Butts began sexually assaulting him. Bonin drove into Cajon Pass in San Bernardino County, as Shelton had oral sex with him. Bonin soon parked the vehicle and raped him. Enraged with his fear and resistance, Bonin sexually assaulted him, and Bonin and Butts physically assaulted him until he lost consciousness. He was violated with foreign objects, including a stick, causing him to enter a state of shock which proved fatal. He was discarded beside a gravel road in Cajun Pass. The night of the following day, Bonin and Butts encountered 17-year-old West German student Marcus Grabs attempting to hitchhike from the Pacific Coast Highway. According to Bonin, he engaged in consensual relations with the youth, who agreed to be bound with lengths of cord and ignition wire. Bonin then retrieved a knife and intimidated Grabs as Butts drove toward Bonin's home. There, Grabs was again raped and beaten, and Grabs reportedly broke loose and punched Bonin. This caused Bonin to strangle him and stab him 77 times. His body was discarded in Malibu Creek the following day. On August 9th, Bonin was again detained for molesting a 17-year-old boy from Dana Point. This violation of the conditions of his parole should have resulted in Bonin being returned to prison at Orange County Jail. However, an administrative error committed prior to Bonin's scheduled court date resulted in his release. On August 13th, Fraser drove to collect Bonin from jail. He later recollected that as he drove Bonin home, Bonin said, "No one's going to testify again. This is never going to happen to me again." At the time, Fraser had interpreted this as a statement of remorse. Resuming his murder spree, Bonin did not show at his court appointment. Bonin had also returned to his parents' house. He gradually developed a reputation as a child molester among local residents, due to his habit of inviting young boys into his house, under the guise of providing alcohol and viewing pornography with them. Some neighbors recalled observing young boys accompany Bonin inside, and they would later hear screaming and crying. Bonin's family, who were occasionally present, claimed to have never witnessed Bonin abuse them. On August 20th, Bonin picked up 18-year-old Robert Wirostek in Newport Beach. Bonin allegedly coaxed him to perform oral sex by offering him $50. At knife point, Bonin bound and raped him, and then drove to Butts's residence. On the drive, Butts performed oral sex on Wirostek before striking him and taking Bonin's place as driver. Bonin then tortured Wirostek by bending his fingers, then sexually assaulting and bludgeoning him before strangling him. Wirostek's body was found on September 27th, alongside Interstate 10. On August 27th, Bonin and Butts abducted 15-year-old Hollywood boy Donald Ray Hayden on Santa Monica Boulevard. Butts was driving the van. Bonin offered him $50 for consensual sex. When Butts made an accidental wrong turn, Hayden became frantic, causing Bonin to beat, bind, torture, and sodomize him. Bonin then strangled him to death. Butts performed oral sex on his corpse before the pair dumped his body at a construction site near the Ventura Freeway. It was discovered hours later. Hayden's rectal damage led to a coroner's theory that he had been impaled by a large object. On September 9th, Bonin and Butts encountered a 17-year-old boy from La Mirada, David Luis Murillo, cycling. After Murillo entered the van, Bonin offered him money for sex, which was refused. He then attempted to fondle Murillo before binding him and driving to Butts' residence. As Butts drove, Bonin sexually assaulted and raped him. He then traded places with Butts, who performed oral sex on and beat Murillo. He then parked the vehicle, bound him, and raped him more. He was extensively bludgeoned, then strangled. His body was discovered alongside Highway 101 on the 12th. Bonin is not known to have killed again until on or about November 1st. He and Butts abducted and murdered an unidentified young man with brown hair, whom Bonin claimed to be 5'6" in tall and 18 years old. At some point, Bonin allegedly said the man was to die because "your folks paid us to find you and kill you." The two beat him, and Bonin strangled him to death before inserting an ice pick into his head. His body was discarded alongside State Route 99, south of Bakersfield. On November 30th, an unassisted Bonin abducted 17-year-old Frank Dennis Fox from Bellflower. Bonin sodomized him and strangled him until he died. His body was found 2 days later alongside the Ortega Highway, 5 miles east of San Juan Capistrano. The body bore signs of binding and blunt force trauma. 10 days later, a 15-year-old boy from Long Beach, John Frederick Kilpatrick, left his home and was offered money for sexual services by Bonin. After engaging in mutual oral sex, Kilpatrick was bound and raped by Bonin before being transported to his parents' house, where he was flagellated with string and then strangled to death with it. His body was discarded near Rialto. It was found on December 13th, but Kilpatrick remained known as a John Doe until August 5, 1980. Because of his troubled background, which caused him to disappear for days at a time, his mother hesitated to report the disappearance. His friends also mistakenly reported seeing him at the mall. As a result, he was not reported missing until February. On January 1, 1980, Bonin encountered 16-year-old Ontario boy Michael Francis McDonald near the Chino airport. Under the guise of providing drugs for him to sell, Bonin parked behind an apartment building. In the van, Bonin bound, beat, and raped him. His body was found alongside Highway 71 in the outskirts of Chino. And his body was not identified until March 24th. On the morning of February 3rd, Bonin invited a 16-year-old boy into his parents' house to drink and have sex. Bonin allegedly caught him stealing $100 from his billfold and furiously resolved to commit a murder. Later that evening, he drove to Hollywood with Gregory Miley with the specific intention of committing a murder with him. They encountered 15-year-old Charles Miranda nearby the Starwood nightclub along Santa Monica Boulevard. According to Miley, Bonin and Miranda had consensual sex in the van as he drove. Bonin then told Miley that Miranda was going to die. Miley asked why Bonin would not just let him go. Bonin replied, "Because he'll know us and know the van." Bonin beat, bound, and gagged Miranda, and informed him that he had to be killed due to his earlier robbery. Miranda began begging for his life. Bonin began sexually assaulting Miranda, and Miley unsuccessfully attempted to rape him. In frustration, the two started physically assaulting him, and Bonin strangled him to death. His body was later dumped in a Los Angeles alleyway. 5 minutes after discarding the body, Bonin suggested to Miley to do another one. Miley initially protested and stated he wanted to go home, but eventually complied. A few hours later in Huntington Beach, the pair encountered 12-year-old James McCobb. McCobb had been dropped off at a corner bus stop by his older brother, who had given him money to take the bus to Disneyland. He was lured into Bonin's van on the promise he would be driven to his intended destination, and that he would be given marijuana. According to Miley, McCobb got in the van, and Bonin drove to a grocery store. Bonin parked the van and began hugging and kissing McCobb before binding him and telling him he was being kidnapped for ransom. Bonin began punching him, and as Miley drove around, Bonin raped him and bludgeoned him with a tire iron. Bonin then forced him to sleep in his arms. Upon McCobb's waking, Miley and Bonin beat him into unconsciousness, and Bonin crushed his neck with a tire iron. Bonin then strangled McCobb to death, and he and Miley discarded the corpse at a construction site in Walnut. McCobb's body was discovered 3 days later. The next day, Bonin was arrested for violating the conditions of his parole. He was remanded in custody at the Orange County Jail until March 4th. Following his release, he was hired as a truck driver at Dependable Drive-Away. Bonin angered his boss, who was unaware of his status as a sex offender, by picking up hitchhikers in his presence on one occasion, and by taking long, unnecessary routes, which detectives later took interest in. On March 14th, Bonin abducted 18-year-old Van Nuys man Ronald Gatlin. Bonin beat and sodomized him and hacked at him with an ice pick. The following day, his bound body was found behind an industrial building. On March 21st, Bonin offered a ride to 14-year-old hitchhiker Glenn Norman Barker. Barker was beaten and raped with objects, then strangled with a ligature, burned with a cigarette, and had his rectum distended. Later that day, 15-year-old Russell Dwayne Rugg was abducted in Garden Grove. He was bound, beaten, and strangled to death, after an estimated 8 hours of captivity. The two boys' bodies were discarded in Cleveland National Forest, close to the Ortega Highway, and found on the 23rd. One Friday evening in March, Bonin offered 17-year-old William Ray Pugh a ride home as the pair left Frazier's residence. Pugh accepted, and during the ride, Bonin asked him to have sex. According to Pugh, he attempted to leave the van once Bonin had slowed down at a stoplight. Bonin grabbed him, dragged him back inside, and admitted that he enjoyed abducting, restraining, torturing, and strangling hitchhikers. Bonin then informed Pugh how to murder without getting caught. Bonin said that he had chosen to refrain from sexually assaulting and murdering Pugh not out of sentiment, but because the pair had been seen leaving Frazier's party together. Pugh was driven to what he claimed was his home, and when the van left, he ran to his house. Pugh kept associating with Bonin. On March 25th, Bonin and Pugh abducted 15-year-old runaway Harry Todd Turner from a Los Angeles street. Turner had escaped a boys' home in Lancaster 4 days prior. Pugh later testified that he and Bonin lured Turner into Bonin's van with an offer of $20 for sex. After binding and sodomizing Turner, Bonin bit into his penis until it tore, and then ordered Pugh to beat him up. After Pugh bludgeoned and beat him, Bonin strangled him to death. His body was discarded behind a Los Angeles business. On April 10th, Bonin was discharged from parole. He encountered 16-year-old Bellflower youth Stephen John Wood walking to school. Wood's older brother had introduced him to Bonin, so he willingly entered Bonin's van. His hog-tied body was discarded in a Long Beach alleyway, close to the Pacific Coast Highway. Bonin allegedly waited until dusk to discard it. Wood's autopsy revealed he had been killed by strangulation. On April 29th, Bonin encountered 19-year-old Darren Kendrick at his workplace in Stanton. Bonin lured Kendrick into the van on the pretext of selling him drugs. Bonin then drove to Butts's apartment in Lakewood. There, he asked Kendrick whether he was gay. Kendrick attempted to flee. Bonin and Butts bound him, and Butts sodomized him. Bonin raised the volume of Butts' sound system to cover Kendrick's screams. Butts then held Kendrick's mouth open while Bonin poured chloral hydrate down his throat, causing him to sustain caustic chemical burns. Kendrick fought his attackers but stopped, before complaining of dizziness. Bonin then strangled him, and Butts drove an ice pick into his ear, fatally wounding his cervical spinal cord. His body was discarded behind a warehouse close to the Artesia Freeway. On May 12th, Bonin abducted and murdered an acquaintance of his. He later stated that he decided to kill them when he had awoken that morning, because he was tired of having him around. The body of 17-year-old Lawrence Sharp was discarded behind a Westminster gas station. His body was found on the 18th, and his autopsy revealed that he had been bound, sodomized, beaten, and strangled. On May 19th, Bonin asked Butts to accompany him on a killing. However, Butts reportedly refused. Unassisted, Bonin abducted 14-year-old Southgate boy Sean King in Downey. King was strangled to death before his body was discarded in Yucaipa. Bonin then visited Butt's apartment and bragged to him about the murder. By early 1980, Bonin's murders were receiving considerable media attention, and leading gay rights activists had offered a reward totaling $50,000 for information, leading to the conviction of the suspect or suspects. Having by this stage determined a definitive link between many of the recent murders, investigators from the jurisdictions where victims had been abducted or discovered had begun sharing information in their hunt for the suspect or suspects. 6 officers from 3 of the jurisdictions formed a task force dedicated to their apprehension. By May, Pugh had been arrested for auto theft. On May 28th, he overheard the details of the ongoing murders on a local radio broadcast and confided to a counselor that he knew the perpetrator's modus operandi, which was described to him by Bonin 2 months prior. This counselor reported Pugh's suspicions to the police, who in turn relayed a confidential tip to Los Angeles Police Department, LAPD, Homicide Sergeant John St. John. St. John conducted an extensive interview with Pugh the next day. Although Pugh withheld the fact that he had accompanied Bonin on one of his murders, the information he provided led St. John to deduce that Bonin might be the Freeway Killer. That same day, Bonin invited 18-year-old homeless drifter James Michael Monroe, whom he had encountered while cruising for young male prostitutes, to move into his family's home in exchange for sex. Monroe was a runaway from St. Clair, Michigan, who had been evicted from his family's home in early 1980. Monroe had gone to California to meet a friend, but became homeless after he was robbed of money that he earned as a male prostitute in Hollywood. While at Bonin's home, Monroe, who was bisexual, began a consensual sexual relationship with him. He accepted an offer of employment at Dependable Drive-Away. Monroe later described his initial impression of Bonin as being a good guy and really normal. On June 1st, Bonin informed Monroe that he wanted them both to abduct, sexually assault, and murder a hitchhiker. A police investigation into Bonin's background revealed his extensive history of convictions for sexually assaulting teenage boys. St. John assigned a surveillance team to monitor his movements. They began surveilling Bonin on the evening of June 2nd, 1 hour prior to Bonin and Monroe discarding the body of Bonin's final victim. Hours earlier, Bonin and Monroe encountered 18-year-old Stephen J. Wells on El Segundo Boulevard. Bonin and Monroe enticed him into the van. According to the pair, upon learning Wells was bisexual, Bonin had consensual sex with Wells before persuading him to go to his parents' house. There, the two continued having sex. Later, Bonin paid Wells $200 to allow himself to be bound with clothesline. Wells became suspicious of their intentions and frantic. Bonin retreated to the kitchen, telling Monroe they were both going to kill Wells. They then gagged and beat him in a hallway. Wells pleaded for his life, but Bonin strangled him to death. Bonin ordered Monroe to retrieve a cardboard box, which the two placed Wells' body inside of, and carried to Bonin's van. Later, while driving to Butts' apartment, Bonin informed Monroe that he, Butts, and others had committed many of the Freeway Killer murders. At the apartment, Bonin invited Butts to view Wells's body in the van. Bonin then asked where he should dispose of the corpse. Monroe later testified that Butts dissuaded Bonin from discarding it in the nearby canyons and recommended discarding him near a gas station. They drove to a disused gas station in Huntington Beach and discarded him there. The body was discovered 5 hours later by two brothers who had parked nearby. Bonin and Monroe returned to Bonin's house. Later that night, Bonin hinted to Monroe, who was fearful for his life, that he should stay quiet regarding Wells' murder or else face potential death. After 9 days of uneventful surveillance, on June 11th, plainclothes police observed Bonin driving throughout Hollywood, unsuccessfully attempting to lure 5 separate boys into his van, before succeeding in luring one. The police followed Bonin until he parked at a service station close to the Hollywood Freeway, then discreetly approached the vehicle. Upon hearing screams and banging sounds coming from inside the van, the officers forced their way inside. They discovered Bonin raping 17-year-old Orange County runaway Harold Eugene Tate, whom he had handcuffed and bound. Bonin was initially charged with the rape of a minor and held on suspicion of Miranda's murder. He was detained in lieu of $250,000 bond. Later, Bonin's girlfriend notified his boss of his arrest, adding that the arrest was in connection to the Freeway Killer case. This caused Monroe, who was already apprehensive at Bonin's absence from work that day, to become frantic. The next day, Monroe stole Bonin's car and fled back to Michigan, where he temporarily resided before being arrested. Inside Bonin's van, investigators discovered numerous artifacts which proved his culpability in the Freeway Killer murders. These included various restraining devices, knives, and a tire iron. They also noted the removed door handles. A forensic examination of the van and Bonin's home revealed extensive traces of bloodstains. Inside the glove box, investigators discovered a scrapbook of newspaper clippings related to the murders. Although initially alleging his innocence in the murders, Bonin confessed his guilt to St. John after reading a letter from Sean King's mother, imploring him to reveal the location of her son's body. Bonin made sure to clarify, however, that it was not to ease the mother's pain, but on the knowledge that, because King was buried in San Bernardino County, police would likely buy him a hamburger for lunch on the extensive trip. Over the course of several evenings, Bonin confessed to abducting, raping, and killing 21 young men and boys in graphic detail. He expressed no remorse for his actions, but showed extreme embarrassment and regret over being caught. An Orange County investigator recalled that there was not a policeman in that room that did not want to kill Bonin for his confession. Bonin stated that his primary accomplice in the murders had been Butts, while Miley and Monroe were accomplices in other murders. Bonin was physically linked to many of the murders by blood and semen stains. Numerous carpet fibers found upon 7 of the victims' bodies were a precise match with the carpeting in Bonin's van. Furthermore, on 3 bodies, investigators found hair samples which were a precise match with Bonin. Medical evidence revealed that 6 of the murders for which he was charged were committed by a unique windlass strangulation method, which was later referred to by Bonin's prosecutor as a signature or a trademark. Initially formally arraigned for the murder of Grabs on July 25th, by July 29th, Bonin had been charged with an additional 15 murders, to which he had confessed, and upon which the prosecution believed they had sufficient evidence to obtain a conviction. In addition to the 16 murder indictments, he was also charged with 11 counts of robbery, 1 count of sodomy, and 1 count of mayhem. He was held without bond. Bonin was not brought to trial for the murders of Mark Shelton, Robert Wyrostek, John Kilpatrick, Michael McDonald, or the November 1979 John Doe, because police did not find sufficient evidence linking him alone to the crimes. This is despite Bonin confessing to the murders of Kilpatrick and McDonald. On August 8th, all charges were formally submitted against Bonin. 3 days later, attorney Earl Hansen was appointed as his legal representative. He remained Bonin's attorney until October 1981, when, at Bonin's request, he was replaced by William Charvet and Tracy Stewart. Based on Bonin's confession, police obtained a warrant authorizing a search of Butts' Lakewood property on the same date as Bonin's initial arraignment. This July 25th search uncovered evidence linking Butts to several murders which Bonin had already confessed to. Butts was brought before a municipal court on July 29th and charged with accompanying Bonin on 6 murders and with 3 counts of robbery. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department told the press, Bonin and Butts are believed to be responsible for the kidnapping, torture, and murder of at least 21 young males between May 1979 and June 1980, 14 of which had been committed in their jurisdiction. Despite initially proclaiming his innocence, Butts soon confessed to having accompanied Bonin upon each of the murders he was charged with, and to have sexually abused several victims. Butts claimed to have participated in the murders primarily out of fear, claiming, "It was either go or become the next victim," adding he only found the courage to confess upon learning Bonin was in custody. Butts was adamant he had had only a limited role in the victim's torture, but confessed to actively torturing one of them. He claimed that upon their successfully luring a victim into the van, he would typically drive a short distance before stopping the vehicle in order to assist Bonin in restraining and torturing their captive. He claimed his participation in the murders was typically limited to restraining the victims, but he admitted to mutilating one victim with a wire coat hanger. He said that some victims had been subjected to more extensive blunt force trauma than others, because Bonin would escalate the beatings if the victim resisted his sexual advances. Butts rejected an offer to plead guilty to all charges filed against him in exchange for a life sentence, with a minimum of 25 years before the possibility of parole. He did not agree to accept any form of plea bargain or to testify against Bonin. He was brought before Orange County Municipal Court Judge Richard Orozco on November 14, 1980, where he was formally charged with participating in 3 further murders committed in the county. His trial was scheduled for July 27, 1981. On July 31, 1980, Monroe was arrested in his hometown, Port Huron, Michigan. He was extradited to California and charged with Wells' murder. He pleaded innocent to all charges against him on August 14. Miley, who was in Texas, discussed his role in the Miranda and Macabe murders in a recorded phone conversation with a friend, thus substantiating Bonin's earlier confession. On August 22, Miley was arrested, and he was charged by California authorities with the murders of Miranda and Macabe. On December 18, he pleaded not guilty to 2 charges of first-degree murder, but at 2 pretrial hearings in May 1981, he pleaded guilty. First-degree murder charges were brought against the 20-year-old acquaintance of Bonin, Eric Martin Winans, in December 1980. After police learned Pugh had willingly accompanied Bonin in Harry Todd Turner's murder, Winans's charges were dropped in January 1981, with the county prosecutor citing insufficient evidence as the cause. At a preliminary hearing held in Los Angeles County before Los Angeles County Superior Court Judge Julius Leatham on January 2, 1981, Bonin formally pleaded innocent to 14 first-degree murder charges and numerous counts of sodomy, robbery, and mayhem. In 11 of these indictments, a felony murder-robbery special circumstance was also alleged. Bonin was ordered to return to court on January 7 for pretrial motions and the formal setting of a trial date. On the 7th, Butts was arraigned on 5 counts of murder and 3 counts of robbery. By this point, he had been listed as an accomplice in the murders of Lundgren, Shelton, Grabs, Hayden, Murillo, Wirostek, Kendrick, Wells, and the November 1979 John Doe. 4 days after his formal plea, he committed suicide by hanging himself with a towel in his cell. He had attempted suicide at least 4 times prior to his arrest. His attorney, Joe Ingber, theorized that his depressive state had been magnified by the impending release of transcripts of his client's testimony at the preliminary hearing, in which Butts had graphically described his victim's torture. He was worried about the effect it would have on his friends and family. The suicide rendered Butts' recorded testimony in 3 cases inadmissible as evidence. The charges against Bonin in relation to Shelton, Wirostek, and the John Doe were therefore dropped in early 1981. Both Miley and Monroe agreed to testify against Bonin in court, in exchange for being spared the death penalty, and the dismissal of additional charges of sodomy and robbery filed against Monroe. In the case of Miley, Norris agreed to accept 2 separate pleas of guilty to first-degree murder. This was in exchange for 2 concurrent sentences of life imprisonment, with a possibility of parole after 25 years, if Miley agreed to testify against Bonin at both upcoming trials. William Pugh also agreed to testify, having pleaded guilty to 1 count of voluntary manslaughter, for which he later received 6 years in prison. On October 19th, Bonin was brought to trial in Los Angeles County, charged with the murder of 12 of his victims whose bodies had been found within this constituency. He was tried before Superior Court Judge William Keene. The trial commenced on November 5th. Norris, acting as prosecutor, sought the death penalty for each count of murder for which Bonin was tried. Norris described Bonin's routine and technique with regards to his victims' torture, and how he would reach the climax of the orgy by killing them. He asserted that Bonin murdered as a group sport, but with accomplices that he had groomed because of their low mentality. Miley and Monroe testified against Bonin, describing their murders in graphic detail. Miley testified to his participation in the murders of Miranda and McCobb, describing how the 2 victims were beaten and tortured before being murdered. He said that Bonin had pressed a tire iron against Miranda's neck, and Miley jumped down on him, killing him. The strategy of Charvet and Stewart was to challenge the credibility of the prosecution's witnesses, and to suggest that significant mitigating factors as to the causes of Bonin's behavior lay in the extensive physical, sexual, and emotional abuse he had endured throughout his early life. They summoned Dr. David Foster, an expert on the developmental effects of abuse on children, to testify as to the conclusions of his psychological examinations of Bonin. He opined that as a result of repeated abandonment as a child, Bonin had not received the nurturing, protection, and behavioral feedback necessary for sufficient psychological development. He said the abuse of Bonin had been so consistent and prevalent that he was confused as to the differences between violence and love. In a direct rebuttal, the prosecution summoned forensic psychiatrist Park Dietz, a noted expert in impulse control disorder and sexual sadism disorder, who testified that Bonin's behavior was inconsistent with an inability to control his impulses, and that his actions were reflective of planning as opposed to impulsive behavior. He concluded that Bonin was a sexual sadist, and that although he suffered from an antisocial personality disorder, neither of these conditions had impaired his ability to control his actions. Against overruled objections from the defense, Fresno-based reporter David Lopez waived his previously sought immunity under California's Shield Law and agreed to testify on behalf of the prosecution as to the details of 7 interviews Bonin had granted him between December 1980 and April 1981. Lopez testified that Bonin had said he would refuse to talk with any other reporter if Lopez would agree not to broadcast the precise details of the interview. When Lopez had agreed to these conditions, Bonin confessed to him that he was the Freeway Killer and that he had killed 21 victims. Allegedly, Bonin had confided that although he resented the prospect of being executed, he had opted to commit murder simply because he had enjoyed the sound of kids dying. When Lopez asked Bonin what he would be doing if he were still at large, Bonin had replied he would still be killing, because it got easier with each one we did.
You picked him up. Did he happen to say where he was going?
I believe he said he was headed down through Mexico, headed down towards South America. We started heading south, and I started talking to him about did he meet any gay people and everything, and he told me he was gay himself. So that's when I asked him if he'd like to get it on, and he said yes. So I turned around and headed north. I parked, and we got in the back and started getting it on. and that's when I stabbed him in the arm. I stabbed him with the left arm. I stabbed him again, and then again and again. I pulled him out of the van, and he was still alive. I just kept on stabbing him.
Was he nude or was he?
He was nude.
Okay. What'd you do with the clothes? And
I threw it out with him.
Closing arguments were in late December. Norris described Bonin as someone who derived extreme pleasure from his victim's suffering, and that he acted with malice aforethought. Norris outlined the torture Bonin's victims had endured, before concluding his closing arguments by urging the jury to give him what he has earned. Charvet did not specifically ask the jurors to find Bonin not guilty, instead requesting they only return the reasonable verdict you can bring. This indicated a likelihood of not guilty verdicts on at least some counts Bonin was charged with. Charvet doubted the credibility of some of Miley and Monroe's testimony. He emphasized their turning state's evidence made them tailor their testimony to the desires of the police. He reminded the jury he had exposed inconsistencies in Monroe's account of Wells' murder, that Monroe lied on numerous occasions, that Bonin had been extensively abused as a child, and of the diagnoses the doctors in Atascadero had reached. He said the prosecution's case was full of holes, and alleged they had resorted to revulsion tactics, in the hope Bonin would be convicted upon that basis. On December 28th, the jury formally began their deliberations. On January 6, 1982, they convicted Bonin of 10 of the murders for which he was tried. He was found not guilty of the murders of Lundgren and King, of committing sodomy upon Grabs, of committing mayhem upon Lundgren, and of robbing one other victim. Later, the prosecution and defense made alternate pleas for the actual sentence the jury should decide, with Norris requesting the death penalty and Charvet requesting life imprisonment. The jury further found that the special circumstances required within California state law, multiple murders and robbery, had been met in the cases for which Bonin was found guilty, and thus unanimously recommended he receive the death penalty. Bonin was cleared of King's sodomy and murder because he had led police to King's body in 1980 under the agreement that his doing so could not be used against him in court. Therefore, the prosecutors had discussed King's disappearance at the trial, but not the discovery of his body. He was cleared of the charges of mayhem and murder against Lundgren because, according to Lopez, he had strenuously denied committing this particular killing in their interviews. In February, Charvet argued against imposition of the death verdict returned by the jury. Despite his impassioned appeal, Keene formally sentenced Bonin to death for the 10 murders, and ordered that if his death sentence were commuted to one of life imprisonment, the sentences should run consecutively. Bonin was then ordered to await his execution via the gas chamber at San Quentin State Prison. He remained unmoved upon learning of the sentence, having earlier informed his attorney he fully expected to receive the death penalty. Prior to his scheduled second trial in Orange County, Bonin was temporarily removed from death row and held in solitary confinement, where he remained until the conclusion of this trial. This was largely due to the fact he had previously received a severe beating by an incarcerated gang member with whom he had shared a cell. On August 1st, both counsels delivered their closing arguments, and the jury retired. They deliberated for less than 3 hours before announcing on the 2nd that they had found Bonin guilty of each count of murder and robbery. After 3 days deliberating Bonin's penalty on August 22nd, the jury announced their recommendations that he be sentenced to death on each count. On August 26, Bonin received 4 further death sentences. In his years on death row, Bonin undertook painting and writing. He wrote a series of short stories called Doing Time, stories from the mind of a death row prisoner. He became close friends with convicted murderers Lawrence Bittaker, Randy Kraft, who shared the nickname Freeway Killer, Douglas Clark, and Jimmy Lee Smith. He also corresponded with numerous individuals, including the mothers of some of his victims. To the mothers, he never expressed regret or remorse over the murders, purposefully withholding information his victims' families sought, and seemingly deriving pleasure from their discontent. Bonin once informed the mother of Sean King that her son had been his favorite victim, as he was such a screamer. Bonin was scheduled to be executed by lethal injection in 1992, following the execution of Robert Alton Harris, the first inmate California had executed since 1967. Harris had exhibited evident symptoms of discomfort, including convulsions, for up to 4 minutes throughout his 15 minutes in the gas chamber. As such, the state of California opted to use lethal injection as an alternate execution method, branding the gas chamber as cruel and unusual. At 6 p.m. on the 23rd, Bonin was moved from his cell to a death watch cell, where he ordered his last meal: 2 large pizzas, 3 pints of ice cream, and 3 six-packs of Coca-Cola. His last hours were spent with 5 people he had chosen, including his attorney, his chaplain, and a prospective biographer. His attorney said that he had not detected any remorse in Bonin. Around 1 hour prior to his scheduled execution, the Supreme Court refused to hear Bonin's final plea to overturn his death sentence, deciding that Bonin's attorneys had not failed to give him adequate legal representation by not earlier submitting claims of discovered evidence attesting to Bonin's innocence. The Court of Appeals ruled that his attorneys should not have waited until the last minute to submit arguments to overturn or postpone the death sentence. They also rejected Bonin's claim that he had a right to choose between the gas chamber or lethal injection as his method of execution. At 11:45 p.m., Bonin was escorted from his holding cell into the execution chamber. In his final statement, given to the prison warden an hour before his scheduled execution at midnight, Bonin again expressed no remorse for his crimes. He left a note that stated, "I feel the death penalty is not an answer to the problems at hand. I feel it sends the wrong message to the people of this country. Young people act as they see other people acting instead of as people tell them to act. I would advise that when a person has a thought of doing anything serious against the law, that before they did, they should go to a quiet place and think about it seriously." Bonin was executed by lethal injection inside the gas chamber at San Quentin State Prison on February 23, 1996, 14 years after his first death sentence had been imposed. He was the first person to be executed by lethal injection in the history of California. Bonin was pronounced dead at 12:13 a.m. He was 49. None of Bonin's relatives chose to witness his execution, although the event was witnessed by several relatives of his victims. According to several witnesses, Bonin's execution passed without complications, and he was heavily sedated throughout the latter stages of the procedure. On this subject, Governor Pete Wilson, who had rejected a submitted plea for clemency from Bonin's attorneys 3 days before the execution, called Bonin the poster boy for capital punishment. Monroe was sentenced to a term of 15 years to life for the second-degree murder of Wells in 1981. Miley was sentenced to a term of 25 years to life for the first-degree murder of Miranda in 1982. On May 25, 2016, Miley died of injuries he had sustained 2 days previously when he was attacked by another inmate in an exercise yard at Mule Creek State Prison. Pugh was sentenced to 6 years in prison for the voluntary manslaughter of Harry Turner in 1982.